Good morning and welcome to the Grace Hour broadcast, brought to you every Sunday morning at this time by the Missionary Church Association in Jamaica. I'm your host, Nigel Wilkinson. This morning we have with us once again Reverend Teddy Jones, Chairman of the Missionary Church Association in Jamaica, as well as Pastor of the Grace Missionary Church. As always, we invite you to write to us for comment or counsel. Our email address is mcaj@cwjamaica.com. This morning's broadcast is sponsored by the Portmore Missionary Church, located in Edgewater, St. Catherine. The pastor, Reverend Spencer Cahoon, along with Associate Pastor Kavon Edwards and the congregation, invite you to worship with them in their morning service commencing at 8. Do stay with us. In a moment, we bring you this morning's message.
This is your house. This is your house. Father, come and dwell here, Lord. This is your house. This is your house. A holy house of prayer, where the lost and the lonely bring their burdens and their cares. This is your house. This is your house. Lord, come and dwell.
In using John's Gospel as part of the text for this State of the Church address, we indicated that John wrote to the church at Ephesus. No doubt he would have seen certain disturbing signs and used his first-hand knowledge of the life and ministry of Jesus as the template for correction. At the very outset then, chapter 2, he gets right to it, taking aim at the idleness, inertia, and irrelevance which had infected the faith community, using the first sign of water being turned into wine. He then does a surprising thing, taking an event from the final week of Jesus before the cross and placing it at the start of his gospel. While the other gospel writers locate it chronologically, John locates it thematically. He is dealing with the state of the church. Not only had the faith community been infected as described above, it had become distracted and disoriented. The events of the cleansing of the temple confront the contemporary distraction of the church by its fascination with the marketplace and its disorientation with regards to its priorities. Let's listen to the narrative from John chapter 2, verses 13 to 17. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So let's begin with the disorientation of the church, which this text places front and center. Jesus is portrayed here in one of the rarely mentioned moments of the expressing of the human emotion of anger. The phrase righteous indignation apparently arose out of this narrative. His rebuke of the leaders of the faith community here indicates the matter which had aroused his anger. The response of the disciples likewise provides a clue. Stop turning my Father's house into a market, and zeal for your house will consume me. Obviously, the faith community had allowed the place of corporate worship to be replaced at its center by activities that, though legitimate, ought not to occupy the central place and that which ought to be central had been made into a sideshow. Thanks to Matthew in chapter 21 and verse 13, and Mark in chapter 11 verse 17, we know exactly what was and is supposed to be at the heart of the life and place of the gathered faith community: prayer. Jesus draws upon this long revealed desire of his Father for what the priority of place ought to be, as he quotes from Isaiah 56 verse 7, "These I will bring to my holy mountain, and give them joy in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations." Notice the global missional vision of Yahweh in the statement, "a house of prayer for all nations." The scope of influence that this local place of corporate worship had, as far as God was concerned, stretched far beyond its narrow boundaries to the nations. Wow! What a quantum shift! Think about it. God views what we do in our so-called little corner as being a place of refuge, solace, and spiritual refreshing for all of God's people. People of every color, race, tribe, language, culture. Our parochial attitudes, our modes of operation, which tend to resemble ecclesiastical ghettos. That is, zones of exclusions rather than inclusive spaces of belonging. The temple at the time of Jesus served both locals and visitors. There were those who made pilgrimages over considerable distances to come to that place to meet with God. These would have included persons who had come to learn of God's fame, God's character, God's power, God's justice, God's holiness, and made a choice to follow God's laws and to worship God. In God's very election of the Jews was his stated mission to Abraham, that all the nations would be blessed. Any notion and any practice, therefore, that resulted in anyone, whether so-called insider or outsider, being hindered from that opportunity to commune with God must then be considered a hugely misplaced priority. This is what Jesus saw when he entered the temple. I must point out, for those of us who may not yet be aware or may have overlooked it, that the day Jesus became passionately upset at the misplaced priority and distraction was actually the day before the whip was called into action. It is Mark who provides us with this bit of the details. In Mark 11 and verse 11, Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple courts. He looked around at everything, but since it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So then, Jesus took the benefit of sleeping on it, as it were. Then, from John's account, we get another important detail of the deliberate, delayed response of Jesus. John 2, verse 15. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. The point is that there was nothing impulsive about the reaction of Jesus to this descent of the faith community into a state beneath God's design and desire. As much as Jesus was consumed with zeal for his Father's house and what it ought to be and do, he exercised the tremendous restraint. We could say they received a merciful demonstration of wrath. And that right there is something we need more of as we deal with our fellow earthlings. In view of this clear indication that God intends prayer to retain pride of place in our liturgy, it behooves us to contemplate whether our seemingly insatiable appetite for praise and worship has not pushed prior to the fringes? Whatever became of contemplative prayer in worship? Does our love affair with noise and movement in worship serve to push times of personal meditation, solitude, and penitence in our modern temple court off the radar? How do we select those who will lead in the various prayers? Do we convey a sense that only those with a degree or those who drive a certain vehicle or drive a vehicle at all can pray publicly? When we apply the label of intercessor to a select few, are we suggesting that the masses gathered for worship can only be prayed for and never do the praying? God's intent is that his house be and remain a place of prayer for all.
We dedicate this temple to you, Lord. Let your glory fill this sanctuary. Be enthroned on the praises of your people. Lord, we agree in unity. This is your house. Father, come and dwell. Oh Lord, this is your house. A holy house of prayer, where the lost and the lonely bring their burdens and their cares. This is your house. This is your house. This is your house. Oh Lord.
It is our prayer that you are blessed and challenged by the message delivered by Reverend Teddy Jones. For comment or counsel, please email us at mcaj@cwjamaica.com. Before we go, we have some announcements to share with you. The induction service for Pastor Stanford Witter will be held at the Bethel Missionary Church, Nain, St. Elizabeth, on Sunday, March 31, commencing at 4 p.m. The speaker will be Reverend Garnet Roper, President of the Jamaica Theological Seminary. The Queensberry Missionary Church, Southfield, St. Elizabeth, invites you to their Harvest Thanksgiving service to be held next Sunday, March 31, commencing at 4 p.m. And the Grace Missionary Church, 7 West Avenue, Kingston 8, will be having an all-night prayer meeting on Friday, March 29, commencing at 9 p.m. and ends at 1 a.m. All are invited to join them. Thanks once again to the Portmore Missionary Church located in Edgewater, St. Catherine, for sponsoring this morning's program. The pastor, Reverend Spencer Cahoon, along with Associate Pastor Kevon Edwards and the congregation, invite you to worship with them in their morning service today, commencing at 8. The Grace Hour is brought to you by the Missionary Church Association in Jamaica. I'm Nigel Wilkinson, wishing for you God's richest blessings for the coming week.
This is your come and dwell.